Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bro Rob coming to you again with the final installment of the Reconstruction period. I'm looking forward to, wrapping this thing up and just trying to give the family out there an idea of, why I believe this part of history is probably one of the most overlooked but most profound um, periods in history. We tend to overlook it, um, and so I'm hoping that through these series of lectures that I've given on the Reconstruction period, I'm just hoping that I've opened your eyes to a couple of things, and I'm just looking to continue to build on the topic. And hopefully, I got a couple of viewers out there. Again, I'm focused on the presentation, so unfortunately, I'm not even looking at the chat. I'm focused on the presentation, and I'm just trying my best to be as thorough as I can as I continue to share this. So, with that being said, I'm going to now flip over to the presentation, and this is where I left off at. This is where I left off at last the last presentation, the 14th Amendment, and Um, the 14th Amendment was passed after the radical Republicans had set up President Andrew Johnson to be impeached, but he wasn't impeached due to a backdoor deal in the Senate by one vote. So just wanted to make sure that I'm covering that as well. But the 14th Amendment, if you notice how it's worded, it's specifically for Africans, newly free Africans here in America. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. So you can clearly see that the radical Republicans in Congress at this time are thinking of a way to amend the Constitution to make us fully uh, embraced Americans. But the law cannot change people's hearts and minds. This is the thing that they could not count. This is the thing that they could not quantify, how quickly or, not that people would accept Africans as full-fledged citizens. So at this point now, I want to speak about the radical Republicans. And the radical Republicans in the fall of 1866, now they have full control of the House and the Senate with the midterm elections. They strongly opposed slavery before, during, and after the Civil War. They vigorously opposed the Democratic Party and most moderate and conservative Republicans. Um, Andrew Johnson, again, in my scholarly opinion, one of the worst presidents in U.S. history, vetoed 21 bills passed by Congress during his term. The radical Republicans overrode 15 of them, just to give you an idea of how polarized Congress was at this time. The radical Republicans demanded harsh policies for the former rebels. Radical Republicans were credited with creating the public school system. I'm going to build on that as well. The Radical Republicans were also, uh, they also created the 13th, 14th, and then I'm going to talk about the 15th Amendment. And those amendments specifically, one more time, for Africans, newly free Africans. and this was their legislative attempt to make us full-fledged citizens. You know, Charles Sumner, he's definitely someone that the family should take a look at. He fought in Congress really hard for newly freed slaves and for them to become self-sufficient. Henry Winter Davis and Benjamin Wade, they are the two gentlemen that offered that bill to Abraham Lincoln. It was called the Wade Davis Bill, and it was a civil rights bill that President Lincoln pocket vetoed. So I wanted to make sure that I got them in the fray as well in this discussion, because they, along with Thaddeus Stevens, were the biggest voices for the radical Republicans in Congress. Southern governments couldn't keep law and order directly following the Civil War. If you could imagine, the South at this time is in complete disarray. The South at this time is in complete disarray. And then with the formation of the Freedmen's Bureau, you could understand they done just lost the Civil War, and now they done came home, and now they got the Union Army telling them what to do. You can't vote, you can't own land, you can't do this, you can't do that. So they was upset. And the Union Army, in addition to the Freedmen's Bureau, was stationed in the South to aid in the enforcement of law and protection of the newly freed enslaved Africans. This is a quote from Thaddeus Stevens. One more time, a large voice for newly freed Africans, and he was just applying his common sense to this thing. He said, "But this is not all that we ought to do before invigorating rebels, invigorated rebels are invited to participate in our legislation. We have turned or are about to turn loose 4 million slaves without a hut to shelter them or a cent in their pockets. Their infernal laws of slavery have prevented them from acquiring an education, understanding the common laws of contract, or of managing the ordinary business of life. This Congress is bound to provide for them until they can take care of themselves. If we do not furnish them with homesteads and hedges around them with protective laws, if we leave them to legislation of their late masters, we had better have left them in bondage. If we fail in this great duty now, when we have the power, we shall deserve and receive the extraction of history and all future ages." So, in my mind, Thaddeus Stevens is looking down the annals of history and thinking to himself that when people look back at this age, what will they say about our integrity in terms of treating our fellow men like men? Very simple. He was, like I said, he was a very principled man in the last election. So the radical Republicans, their idea of being able to control the South, if you'll see here in the diagram, it's also referred to as military reconstruction. They took 5 areas and they occupied them with Union soldiers, and they looked over all that had to do with integrating newly freed Africans back into the American uh, uh, structure, so to speak. The southern states had to rewrite their state constitutions in order to be remitted back into the Union. To ensure compliance and to protect newly freed enslaved Republicans and Southern sympathizers, as well as the Union Army occupied these states, and they continue to do so. and Congress. This was fairly recent, um, during Barack Obama's presidency. Um, they finally stopped watching their elections. Finally, and that was during Barack Obama's term in office, because they felt like, oh man, now the South, they, with a black man being president, now I guess they can have fair elections. I want to point out that we did make major progress, major progress. To this day, to this day, us as African Americans, we have not matched our ancestors and their participation in the political process here in the United States. Um, at that time, and this directly after the Civil War and after the passage of the 14th Amendment, we elected 600 persons to state and federal positions. 1,400 were elected to local positions, legally elected but verbally and physically attacked and driven from their elected positions in local and state government. Um, some Africans, newly free Africans, they flourished after Reconstruction. Um, it makes me think about a man, his name was John Lynch. He was from Mississippi, and he wrote a civil rights bill that he tried to get passed in the 1920s, and it is ironically very similar to the civil rights bill that was passed in the 1960s, right? But I want to point this out. Pickney Pitchback, he was elected governor of Louisiana in 1872. He was the first newly free African to ever be elected governor of any state. Douglas Wilder of Virginia would be the next African American governor in 1989. 117 years later. So again, like I said, I could do a whole presentation on the brothers that was elected to Congress at that time. Um, but let's just say that because they were newly elected, had never been in politics before, there were a couple of missteps. They made some mistakes, right? But that was because they were fresh into politics. They had never been into politics before. So let me continue. This is very, 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 very important. As I've stated in chats in the past, propaganda is a weapon. Propaganda is a weapon. Now, this picture is from the Harvard College Library, right? And what's prominent, you see three white men, they all together, right? And this is just to break down history so that you can understand the political time of day. So you see number one, right? And I hope that you can kind of zero in on the picture. That's a newly built school in the South. It was set aflame by lynch mobs, and then it's a light pole with a young black person hanging from the light pole while the school on fire. To the left, number two, you'll see that's a generic Irish Democrat. Irish Democrat meaning that he was in the North, and he had a hat, and that hat was from the Five Points district in New York, and he held a club denying black men the right to vote. He was like they strong arm. That's what they strong on. They was like they army. That was they army. In terms of sending people out to the polls to make sure that people didn't vote. Then number three, and I believe this is somewhat prominent. That gentleman in the middle, his name is Nathan B. Frost. He holds a dagger and it's called the Lost Cause. And this is how Southerners were feeling. They felt like they had lost the war, and their cause to try to assimilate fully into American culture was cut short because of the Civil War. You see his belt buckle. You see? You see the belt buckle? The Confederate States of America, CSA. I hope you can see that. And then the dagger is say the lost cause. Nathan Forrest was one of the founding members of the Ku Klux Klan. Then number four, to the right, his name was August Belmont. It's ironic because there's a very famous street here in Chicago named Belmont. He was a New York financier. Belmont represented the interests of Northern capitalists, especially Wall Street. He ran Wall Street. And of course, if blacks started to vote, it would mess up all of the labor markets. And I got the good brother, his name is Irritated Genie. He speaks about how when they started lynching, how they attacked only black business owners. And it's also echoed in W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction. Um, at the end of the presentation, and hopefully I can get a panel discussion on the information that I presented. Um, I would love to pick other people's brains about this period because this played a huge role. And then finally, at the very bottom, you'll see that's a ballot box. Um, because I told you that they had to verbally say who they were voting for. Towards the end of the 1860s, they finally developed a ballot box, and all you had to do was check the box, and you can clearly see they standing on the black man head and on his back, and they prepared to strike violence against them. This was a propaganda campaign that lasted for 15 years. If you remember that Freedmen's Bureau paperclip where I got the political cartoon. It had the black man sitting there with his feet kicked up while the white man was out there working. Right? So it was a propaganda campaign that lasted for 15 years. It's very important. Propaganda is a weapon. So now we got to talk about President Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant, as a general, he won the Battle of Vicksburg, all but ensuring the Union victory. Now, Ulysses S. Grant, when he was going to West Point, he was not a great student. The only thing I think he only scored good in one category, and they didn't think he was going to be that good of a soldier. But as it turned out, even though he wasn't good in the classroom, on the field, he performed admirably. And he helped the Union to win the war, right? So the slogan for Ulysses S. Grant in 1869 was "Let us have peace." He was basically echoing to the rest of the country because of the Civil War and everything that was going on in the South with all of these lynchings and and all of these uprisings and things of this nature. He was just trying to tell people that, man, hey, look, we're going to put everything back together and we're going to have peace and we're going to come back together. Because consider now, Abraham Lincoln is the end of the Civil War. Then Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. And then they trying to assimilate Africans back into the American population. And Andrew Johnson is a terrible president. And the country is rocked with all of these scandals. So his slogan, it appealed. It appealed to a broad base of people. But keep in mind now, white men in the South could not vote. So while he was on the campaign trail, he supported Reconstruction and wanted to wrap Reconstruction up as quickly as possible. He had little to no political experience, little to none. And like I said, he was not a great student. So I imagine that Ulysses S. Grant probably was not very highly intelligent, but again, very principled man, but successful in war, right? He took it, and this is what I give him kudos for, credit for. He took aggressive and decisive stands against the Ku Klux Klan and other splinter groups and organizations, and he started what was known as the Force Act in 1871, all but eliminating the Ku Klux Klan. They came back to prominence when Birth of a Nation came out, and it was viewed at the White House. Again, propaganda. He supported westward expansion and the first transcontinental train line from the East Coast to the West Coast. It would also be his undoing because the company that he supported to do the work ended up going bankrupt. It was some funny business. And he was rocked with a bunch of different scandals during his presidency, and it weakened him politically in the eyes of the people. So Ulysses S. Grant, if he was to get props for anything, it would be that he put down the white liners and the Ku Klux Klan with the Force Act of 1871. All right. But in 1869 and approved in 1870, the 15th Amendment, the last amendment specifically for newly freed Africans, right? Section 1 of the 15th Amendment. It says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by the state or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This is very important. Congress, Congress, this was unprecedented in US history. Congress had the ability to enforce this in any state, not just in the South, but in any state, the North as well. Like I told you, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and only certain parts of New York, until this constitutional amendment, Black folks couldn't vote, right? After President Grant's narrow victory, the radical Republicans in Congress, they passed the 15th Amendment giving African American men the right to vote. Being that almost all African Americans at the time were Republican, this amendment would give them some political control over the South, if not social control. So other contributing factors, because now we're about to wrap up Reconstruction. Other contributing factors that led to the end of Reconstruction. First, the Panic of 1873. Oh, I bet you ain't never heard this before. The U.S. went into an economic depression, and due to the failure of the railroads, like I told you, Grant, the company that he had over the Transcontinental Railroad, they lost a lot of money, and it sent the whole country into a depression. Over 1 million people lost their jobs. Nearly 100 banks failed. Right? Then also, and y'all have heard of this before, it's called the Battle of Little Bighorn. And this is when General Custer and Chief Sitting Bull met each other on the battlefield. And Chief Sitting Bull murdered General Custer and the men, and it was a political embarrassment for the United States government. This is very important because Now they eyes turn to, wait a minute, we didn't free these slaves, and now it look like we about to lose control of the country. And then on top of that, the North, they could not continually, indefinitely continue to occupy the South. They started losing morale, and then the cost of having them soldiers down there was too great. On top of that, President Grant's presidency, it was rocked by scandal and corruption at every level, which brings us to the Compromise of 1877. It wasn't really a compromise, but let me try to go into it and explain. The Democratic nominee, his name was Samuel J. Tilden, and the Republican nominee, his name was Ruford B. Hayes. They were in a closely contested election in 1876. Tilden, the Democratic nominee, won the popular vote by 250,000 votes. But the Electoral College in 4 states came into question: Oregon, South Carolina, Louisiana, and then there go it again. There go Florida. Ain't Florida always in some shit? Mm. Congress then forms a 15-member delegation. It consisted of 5 members from the Senate, 5 members from the Supreme Court, and 5 members from the House of Representatives. I don't know. That sound like that was pretty democratic to me. If you considering, you know, those people that was on the Supreme Court, they probably were uh, more along the lines of white supremacists. They probably been there for a number of years. I'm not saying that the white folks that were in Congress were not white supremacists. Of course they are. Everybody at this time are white supremacists. This is how they thinking. But what I'm saying is that the members in the Senate and the members of the House of Representatives more than likely were radical Republicans or moderates. So the compromise went like this: the South would accept Rutherford B. Hayes as president as long as the Republicans made these certain concessions. So that being said, all of the electoral college votes went to Hayes, all 20, making him effectively the 19th president of the United States of America. But before I get to that, and this is why it's called the Grand Betrayal, on record, and you can go and look it up on record, this is regarded as one of the most racist speeches in U.S. history. The gentleman's name, and that is his picture, William Levy, Bill Levy. And this is the speech that he gave to convince Congress to vote for the compromise. Black emancipation caused despair and danger, and further claimed that Louisiana's innocent maidens and helpless infants were in imminent peril. I hold it my sacred duty, he said, to save Louisiana whites from the ruin and degradation which threatened them, and to my beloved state my beloved state from the bondage which oppresses and enslaves her. So basically, his state was in bondage and was oppressed because black folks were going around raping maidens and attacking babies. Yes, please go and look the speech up. I didn't want to put it in the presentation, but I've read the speech from end to end, And let me just say out loud that yeah, in no uncertain terms, this got to be one of the most racist speeches I've ever read. In exchange for accepting Hayes as president, the Democrats asked for these very specific things. First of all, remove the federal troops from the South. What did that do? That allowed them to take back political, social, and economic control of the South. Second, yeah, come on in, bro. I say, hop out for a second. Democrats, they were to receive one key position in the cabinet. That position ended up being postmaster. Third, the South got increased patronage, and for those construction contracts of the railroad. Now, I'm just broadcasting. Give me 2 seconds. I'm about to wrap up. The South, they got increased patronage, and so they was able to make some money as they built those railroads from the East Coast to the West Coast. And then the last thing was that Hayes not run for reelection. So that concludes my presentation on the Reconstruction era. And I just want to say to you out loud that the Grand Betrayal is what set everything in motion for Black folks to not be able to recover until Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement come along. So I appreciate everybody that took the time to listen. Um, I feel like this information will be impactful. If you were to go and take a look at it, I'm just simply giving you what's best, in my opinion, of what we did and some of these practices that we could possibly uh, mimic from my ancestors. But one more time, I appreciate everybody that took time to listen. I feel like the information, once you take a look at it yourself, and when I do the panel discussion, I am going to introduce my resources. I've yet to see anybody come and do a thorough analysis of the resources that they use when they putting these presentations together. So I'm gonna show y'all the books. And then I'm gonna share the lectures that I listen to, so that you can get the same information that I got. But I appreciate everybody' continued support, and I look forward to having this panel discussion. Y'all just let me know when would be appropriate time for y'all to for us to sit down and think about it. Everybody's so enthralled with Kanye West. To be perfectly honest with you, I don't give a good goddamn what Kanye West think. I know slavery was real. I don't care what other people say about slavery. Oh, it didn't happen and all that. I don't care, because I study history. You know what I'm saying? So with that being said, everything that I presented is factual, to the best of my knowledge. And if there's any challenges, please let me know. With that being said, I sign off. Thank y'all. God bless and good night.